You don't set an alarm for 3 a.m., but something does. And if you have ever found yourself suddenly completely awake at 3 in the morning, heart slightly elevated, mind already moving, the room too quiet, you already know that this doesn't feel like ordinary waking. It feels like something happened. Something did, and it wasn't random. Before we start, a clear, honest note. Waking at 3 a.m. is not a single phenomenon with a single cause. This video covers the main physiological mechanisms that drive early morning waking in otherwise healthy adults. It does not cover sleep disorders, sleep apnea, or clinical insomnia, which have distinct mechanisms and require separate clinical evaluation. If you are waking consistently, feeling unrefreshed, or experiencing symptoms that concern you, that is a conversation for your doctor, not YouTube. This is education, not a diagnosis. To understand why 3 a.m. is such a common wake time, you need to understand what sleep actually looks like from the inside. Most people think of sleep as a single continuous state. You close your eyes, you lose consciousness, you wake up 8 hours later. That model is wrong. Sleep is a structured biological process, divided into repeating cycles. Each cycle lasts approximately 90 minutes. Each cycle contains distinct stages with completely different functions. In the early cycles, the first 3 to 4 hours of the night, your sleep is dominated by slow-wave sleep, deep, physically restorative, hormonally active. This is when growth hormone is released, when tissue repair happens, when immune function consolidates. In the later cycles, the second half of the night, roughly from 3 a.m. onward, the architecture shifts. Slow-wave sleep becomes minimal. REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep, begins to dominate. REM sleep is lighter. It is the stage most associated with vivid dreaming, memory consolidation, and emotional processing. And it is the stage from which waking is easiest. This is not a malfunction. It is the design. By 3 a.m., your sleep architecture has already completed most of its deep restorative work. The brain is transitioning into a lighter, more alert biological state. The question is why, for so many people, that transition tips all the way into full waking. The answer begins with a hormone most people associate with stress, cortisol. But the association with stress is only part of the story, and the less interesting part. Cortisol is primarily a circadian hormone. Its job is to prepare your body for the demands of waking life, and it begins that preparation earlier than most people realize. Under normal conditions, cortisol starts rising between 2 and 3 a.m., gradually, quietly, while you are still asleep. By the time you wake, ideally around 6 or 7 a.m., cortisol has peaked in what researchers call the cortisol awakening response. A rapid 2 to 3-fold surge in the 30 to 45 minutes after waking. This surge is not a stress response, it is a preparation signal, mobilizing glucose, activating the immune system, priming the brain for the cognitive demands of the day ahead. In healthy individuals with well-regulated sleep, that 2 a.m. cortisol rise happens below the threshold of full waking. The body senses it, remains asleep, rises naturally a few hours later. But for a significant proportion of adults, particularly those under chronic stress, sleeping irregularly, or experiencing anxiety, the cortisol system becomes sensitized. The early morning rise, instead of staying below the threshold, crosses it. And when cortisol crosses that threshold, the brain interprets it as a signal to wake. Your heart rate picks up slightly, your alertness activates, your eyes open. It is 3 a.m., and your body, in a very specific physiological sense, got ahead of itself. Here is where the research gets precise, and where a 2025 paper added important nuance. The question of whether the cortisol awakening response is driven by the act of waking itself, or whether it is a continuation of an underlying circadian rhythm that would have happened regardless, has been genuinely debated in the literature. The honest answer, as of the current evidence, is both. There is a circadian component. Cortisol rises in the early morning hours as part of the body's internal clock, independent of whether waking occurs. And there is an awakening-dependent component. The act of waking amplifies that rise. What this means for the 3 a.m. phenomenon is important. The cortisol rise that begins at 2 to 3 a.m. is not caused by waking up. For people who wake at 3 a.m., the waking is caused, at least in part, by that cortisol rise crossing the arousal threshold prematurely. The directionality matters. You are not waking and then feeling cortisol. The cortisol is rising, and that is what wakes you. Cortisol is not acting alone. A second mechanism runs in parallel, and it is one that most people who experience 3 a.m. waking have never heard of. Blood glucose regulation. Your brain runs on glucose, not partially on glucose, almost exclusively on glucose. And unlike muscle tissue, which can shift to burning fat during fasting, the brain has very limited metabolic flexibility. It needs a steady glucose supply, all night. In the first half of the night, blood glucose is relatively stable, supported by the digestion of the evening meal and by liver glycogen stores. But by 3 a.m., those stores are beginning to run lower. When blood glucose drops toward the lower edge of the normal range, the body activates a counter-regulatory response. Cortisol, adrenaline, and glucagon are released to mobilize stored glucose and bring levels back up. This counter-regulatory response is designed to protect the brain. But it is also, like the cortisol awakening response, an arousal signal. Adrenaline raises heart rate. Cortisol increases alertness. The brain, registering a metabolic correction in progress, shifts toward waking. You open your eyes. 3 a.m. The glucose dip that triggered it may have been entirely within the normal range, not a dangerous hypoglycemic event. Just enough of a shift to activate the counter-regulatory system, just enough cortisol and adrenaline to cross the arousal threshold. This mechanism is amplified by several things you might have done the previous evening, and it is worth understanding each of them precisely. Alcohol is one of the most common and least understood contributors to 3 a.m. waking. Most people know that alcohol makes them sleepy. What most people don't know is what alcohol does to sleep architecture in the second half of the night. Alcohol suppresses REM sleep in the first half of the night. As it metabolizes, typically completing its metabolism 3 to 5 hours after consumption, REM sleep rebounds. The brain attempts to recover the REM it was denied. REM rebound produces lighter, more fragmented sleep. It is associated with more frequent arousals. It increases the likelihood of full waking during the natural architectural shift that occurs around 3 a.m. Alcohol also affects blood glucose. It initially causes a rise in blood sugar, followed by a prolonged suppression of glucose production by the liver, the same liver that is supposed to be maintaining overnight glucose stability. A late-night drink is, from a sleep architecture perspective, a delayed disruption rather than an immediate one. The disruption arrives precisely when sleep is already at its most architecturally vulnerable. A third mechanism is less well known, but increasingly well documented: body temperature. Core body temperature follows a circadian rhythm that is tightly coupled to the sleep-wake cycle. In the evening, core temperature drops, part of the physiological cascade that initiates sleep onset. It continues to fall through the first half of the night. Around 3 to 4 a.m., core temperature reaches its nadir, its lowest point, and then begins to rise. That rise is part of the biological preparation for waking. It accompanies the cortisol rise. It accompanies the shift toward REM-dominant sleep architecture. In a well-regulated sleep environment, this temperature rise is gradual and stays below the threshold of full arousal. But in a room that is too warm, or in a person whose thermoregulation is disrupted by illness, by perimenopause, by alcohol metabolism, by a heavy meal increasing metabolic heat, the temperature rise can accelerate beyond what the sleeping brain can absorb without waking. Night sweats at 3 a.m. are not a separate phenomenon from early waking. They are the same phenomenon, a thermoregulatory disruption occurring at the exact point in the night when sleep architecture is most vulnerable to it. Now, bring all three mechanisms together. At 3 a.m., a specific convergence is happening in your body simultaneously. Sleep architecture has shifted from deep, slow-wave sleep to light REM-dominant sleep, the stage from which waking is easiest. Cortisol is beginning its early morning circadian rise, and in stress-sensitive individuals, that rise crosses the arousal threshold before its intended time. Blood glucose has been slowly declining for several hours, and if it drops toward the lower end of normal, the counter-regulatory response adds adrenaline and additional cortisol to an already rising arousal signal. Core body temperature has reached its nadir and is beginning its preparatory rise, and if the sleeping environment amplifies that rise, thermoregulatory arousal layers onto everything else. No single one of these mechanisms is necessarily sufficient to cause full waking on its own, but they are all occurring at the same time. They compound, and for a significant proportion of people, particularly under conditions of chronic stress, metabolic dysregulation, poor sleep hygiene, or alcohol consumption, the compound signal is enough to cross the threshold. The 3 a.m. wake-up is not a malfunction. It is a convergence. One more mechanism deserves its own section, because it is the one most directly connected to modern life: chronic stress and cortisol sensitization. Research consistently shows that people with insomnia and people under sustained psychological stress have an earlier and steeper cortisol rise in the early morning hours compared to people with well-regulated sleep. The hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the system that controls cortisol release, becomes more reactive under chronic stress. The threshold at which it triggers a cortisol pulse becomes lower. The timing of that pulse shifts earlier. This is an adaptive response in an evolutionary context. A threat environment requires earlier readiness. The body prepares accordingly. But in a modern context, where the stressor is a deadline, a difficult relationship, financial pressure, or ambient anxiety, the same mechanism produces a body that is primed for 3 a.m. readiness it doesn't need. The alarm goes off. There is no threat, but the cortisol is already rising. The brain is already alert. The thoughts are already moving. And here is the mechanism behind the particular texture of 3 a.m. thinking: the way problems feel larger, the way anxiety feels more credible, the way the mind races in ways it doesn't during the day. In the early morning hours, the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for rational evaluation, perspective, and emotional regulation, is not yet fully engaged. It comes online gradually as cortisol rises and the brain fully wakes, but the amygdala, the threat detection center, is already active. Emotional reactivity without the moderating influence of full prefrontal engagement. Threat detecting without the capacity to contextualize or dismiss. This is why 3 a.m. is when catastrophizing happens. Not because the problems are bigger, because the brain's capacity to evaluate them accurately hasn't fully come online yet. What this means outside the bedroom. The first practical implication is about evening eating. Blood glucose stability overnight is directly influenced by what and when you eat in the evening. A high-carbohydrate dinner, particularly a high-glycemic one, produces a larger post-meal glucose rise, followed by a larger counter-regulatory correction. That correction is more likely to overshoot and trigger the glucose dip mechanism in the early morning hours. Finishing the last meal at least 3 hours before sleep and avoiding high glycemic foods in the evening reduces the amplitude of that overnight glucose fluctuation. Not eliminating it. The counter-regulatory response is a normal part of physiology, but reducing the likelihood that it crosses the arousal threshold at 3 a.m. The second implication is about alcohol timing. If alcohol is consumed, the timing relative to sleep matters more than most people realize. Completing alcohol metabolism before sleep onset, which generally requires a gap of several hours depending on quantity consumed, substantially reduces its REM-suppressing and glucose-disrupting effects in the second half of the night. The third implication is about sleep environment temperature. The 3 a.m. thermoregulatory arousal is amplified by sleeping environments that are too warm. Research consistently identifies cooler sleeping environments in the range of 16 to 19 degrees Celsius for most adults, as conducive to more stable sleep through the early morning transition. The body's natural temperature rise is smaller relative to the room temperature differential. The fourth and most consequential implication is about chronic stress and the cortisol threshold. The cortisol sensitization that produces premature early morning waking is not fixed. It is a dynamic calibration. Consistent sleep and wake times stabilize the circadian cortisol curve. Regular morning light exposure, particularly in the first 30 minutes after waking, anchors the circadian clock and helps calibrate the timing of the early morning cortisol rise. Reducing chronic psychological stress lowers the HPA axis reactivity that shifts the cortisol pulse earlier. None of these interventions work overnight, appropriately given the topic, but they work on the same time scale that the problem developed. Weeks, not years. One final thing worth knowing. If you wake at 3 a.m. and cannot return to sleep, the worst thing the research consistently identifies is clock watching. Checking the time activates the prefrontal cortex just enough to sharpen the anxiety about waking, without activating it enough to provide rational perspective. It locks the brain into the exact state, emotionally reactive, partially aroused, not yet fully rational, that makes returning to sleep most difficult. The physiology of returning to sleep after 3 a.m. waking requires cortisol to stop rising and begin plateauing. It requires the amygdala to receive the signal that no threat is present. It requires core body temperature to remain stable rather than accelerating its rise. Every interaction with a screen, every check of the clock, every calculation of how many hours of sleep remain, these are cortisol-sustaining inputs. They tell the arousal system there is something worth being awake for. The counterintuitive instruction the physiology supports: do not treat 3 a.m. waking as a problem to be solved. Treat it as a biological transition to be waited out. Warmth, stillness, no light, no screens, no arithmetic about sleep hours. Let the cortisol peak and begin its plateau. Let the amygdala find the absence of threat. Let the temperature curve stabilize. For most people, in most circumstances, that is enough. The body that woke you up at 3 a.m. is the same body that knows how to go back to sleep. It just needs you to stop getting in its way. If understanding the mechanism, not just the headline, is useful to you, there's more of this on the channel.